If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The valley was silent except for the wind sliding across dry grass and the faint, uneven breaths of a woman buried beneath the thin layer of earth. Ayoka felt the weight of the soil pressing against her chest each time she tried to inhale. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her back, the rope cutting into her skin. The elders had spoken their judgment without hesitation. The land would take back what it could not use. She tried not to panic. Her lungs burned, and every breath required careful control to avoid wasting air. She listened for footsteps, voices, anything that might signal someone coming back for her. But there was nothing. The tribe had left as soon as the burial was complete. She knew why. They believed watching her die would weaken their resolve. She also understood that returning to her body later would confirm their authority. Ayoka had always carried responsibilities within her small band of families. She gathered roots, tanned hides, stitched clothing, and followed every rule placed on her. When seasons passed without pregnancy, whispers began. The whispers turned into harsh looks, and the harsh looks grew into open frustration. Her worth was measured by her ability to carry new life, and when she could not, the elders saw her as a burden on a shrinking winter food supply. As the minutes stretched, fear crept into her thoughts. Her heartbeat grew faster. She pressed her cheek deeper into the cold ground, trying to stay calm. She told herself not to cry. Tears would waste strength. She focused only on keeping her breathing slow and steady. Far across the valley, Elias Ward rode along an old mining road that few people used anymore. His horse, a tired buckskin gelding, moved at a comfortable pace while Elias kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. A canvas bundle of tools hung from his saddle. He had been checking the abandoned shafts for collapsed timber, something he occasionally did for extra money when ranch work ran thin. Elias had been a different man 3 years earlier. He once lived with his wife, Mara, in a house filled with small hopes, plans for planting fruit trees, raising cattle, building a porch to face the sunrise. When she died from a sudden fever, the world around him lost its shape. He sold half his herd, stopped visiting town, and kept to quiet routines that kept memories at a distance. His main mission now was simple survival: maintain his ranch, avoid trouble, and keep himself from slipping into complete isolation. As Elias guided his horse toward a low stretch of land, he noticed a patch of disturbed soil. It didn't match the surrounding ground. The dirt looked loose, uneven, as if recently filled and not pressed down properly. He slowed his horse and listened. At first he thought he heard the wind. Then he heard it again, a faint, muffled sound, a sharp, quick movement under the surface. He felt his stomach tighten. People did not bury animals like this. And if it was a person, there was no time to think about who or why. Elias dismounted immediately. His boots sank into the loose dirt as he knelt. He pressed his ear to the ground. Another faint movement, a weak gasp. His chest tightened with a sudden surge of urgency. He dug with both hands, pulling away the top layer of soil. His fingers scraped against fabric, then cold skin. A face appeared beneath the dirt. Ayoka's eyes barely open, dust clinging to her lashes. Elias froze for half a second, startled by how close she was to death. Then he reached deeper and cleared her mouth and nose so she could breathe freely. She coughed, a harsh, broken sound that made him work faster. He uncovered her shoulders and arms, noticing the rope binding her wrists. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had walked away knowing she wouldn't survive. Ayoka tried to speak, but her throat could only produce a raw, thin sound. She blinked at Elias, trying to understand who he was and why he was digging her out. For a moment, she feared another punishment, but the steady way he worked told her otherwise. Elias slipped a knife from his belt and cut the ropes carefully, avoiding her scraped skin. He pulled her upright, supporting her weight when her legs gave out. Her body trembled from cold and exhaustion. She won't make it alone, he thought. If I leave her here, she dies. If I take her, trouble might follow. He did not like the idea of bringing a stranger onto his land. He had spent years avoiding attachments of any kind. But leaving her in the dirt was not something he could force himself to do. Her shallow breaths, the marks on her wrists, the quiet way she leaned into him out of pure survival. Those details left him no room to walk away. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her, fastening the buttons himself because her hands were still shaking too much to move. He lifted her onto his horse, holding her steady as she slumped forward. Ayoka felt the rough wool of the coat against her cheek and the warmth spreading back into her limbs. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't know where he was taking her. But for the first time since the elders pronounced her sentence, she felt the panic ease. She let her eyes close, trusting the strength in the arms that held her upright. Elias mounted behind her, guiding the horse toward his ranch. The sky darkened as evening approached, and the crisp air carried the smell of distant pines. He kept one arm around Ayoka to keep her from falling. Each time her head dropped to the side, he tightened his hold. His mission, once so narrow and empty, shifted in that moment. He didn't think about the consequences. He only knew he couldn't let her die. As the ranch lights came into view, a single lantern left burning near the porch, Elias exhaled slowly. He had brought trouble home, but he had also brought someone who needed him. For the first time in years, he didn't ride in with only silence beside him. Elias carried Ayoka inside the cabin the moment he stepped off the horse. Her legs buckled again as soon as her feet touched the ground, so he lifted her fully, holding her close while the door swung shut behind them. The warmth from the stove met the cold on her skin, and she shivered from the sudden change. He set her down on the bed in the corner, a simple frame with clean blankets he had kept out of habit rather than comfort. She tried to sit upright, but her body resisted. Her throat tightened as she struggled to form a sound. Elias noticed the pain in her face and brought a tin cup of warm water to her lips. She drank slowly, watching him with sharp, tired eyes that moved carefully, measuring the space around her as if expecting danger hidden in the corners. He moved with steady, deliberate care. He lit another lantern, added wood to the stove, and shut the windows against the night wind. Each action seemed to calm her breathing a little more. When he returned to the bedside, he crouched beside her to check the rope marks on her wrists. The skin was raw and darkened where the bindings had cut deep. She pulled her hands back slightly, not because she feared him, but because the touch reminded her of how close she had come to being left under the earth. Elias stood again, searching the shelf above the sink for the small tin of salve he kept for horse injuries and his own cuts. When he brought it over, she watched quietly, waiting for his next move. He offered the tin for her to apply herself, understanding the need for distance. She tested her fingers, winced, then allowed him to help when she felt they wouldn't obey her. His hands were careful and respectful, and she relaxed enough to let the pain settle instead of fighting it. Ayoka studied the cabin while he worked. The place carried the shape of a life once shared. 2 chairs at the table, folded blankets arranged neatly on a shelf, and a wooden box filled with sewing tools that had not been touched in years. Nothing looked chaotic, but nothing looked lived in either. It was a house waiting for something to move inside it again. When Elias stepped back, she gathered the coat around her shoulders. The warmth sank into her chest. Her voice finally broke through in a faint whisper. Why? He understood the question without needing more. He set the salve aside and pulled a stool closer. You were alive, he said quietly. That was enough. She held his gaze for a moment, weighing the honesty in his tone. Then she nodded once, accepting the answer more easily than he expected. The exhaustion overtook her again. She lay back against the blankets, her breathing steadier but still shallow. He turned down the lantern so the room softened into dim light. For a long moment he stood there, unsure how close he should remain. She did not seem frightened of him, but she watched his movements with the alertness of someone who had learned not to trust quickly. Before stepping away, he placed a folded blanket at the edge of the bed and pointed to the table where the water and food would be. She understood the gesture. Nothing would be taken from her, and nothing would be asked of her. He moved to the opposite side of the room, sitting near the stove to maintain the fire through the night. He didn't sleep. His thoughts shifted between caution and concern. Someone had tried to erase this woman from the world. Someone might come looking to finish it. He didn't fear conflict, but he didn't invite it either. While he considered what might happen, Ayoka stirred again. Now that her breathing had steadied, sensations returned to her body. The burn in her throat, the ache in her ribs, the lingering pressure in her chest from being buried. She pushed herself upright with effort. Elias rose as well, concerned she might fall, but she steadied herself on the edge of the bed. Her eyes scanned the room once more, trying to understand the man who had taken her from the ground and brought her here. She had seen mercy before, but rarely without expectation. This man offered shelter the same way he offered silence, without force, without asking her to justify her existence. A quiet uncertainty grew in her chest. She did not know what he wanted from life, or why he was alone on land big enough for two families. She did not know why he traveled the valley after dark, but she knew he was not a man who left people behind. The faint warmth returning to her limbs made her realize she was safe for the moment, safe enough to finally rest. She lowered herself back onto the bed and closed her eyes. Her breathing evened out again, and her shoulders loosened. Elias watched her for a short while, taking note of the color returning to her face. She was no longer fading. She was recovering. That changed everything. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled in steady rhythm, filling the space with a calm that neither of them had felt in a long time. Elias leaned back in a chair and kept the lantern burning low, listening to her breathing. The cabin no longer felt like an empty shelter. It felt like a place that someone needed. And he understood, without saying it aloud, that she was not alone anymore. The night passed without disturbance, and by morning, both of them would have to face the consequences of the choice made in the valley. Yet in that quiet room, for the first time since the burial, Ayoka slept without fear. At first light, Elias stepped outside to check the water barrel and gather wood for the stove. The air held the cold bite of early morning, and frost clung to the fence rails. He moved with quiet purpose, but every few minutes he glanced back at the cabin window, watching for any sign of movement inside. He wasn't sure how long her strength would last or how much help she would need, but he wanted to be close if she called out. When he returned, Ayoka was sitting up, her back resting against the wall. The coat was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and her breathing was steady enough for her to stay upright without struggling. She looked toward the door the moment he entered, alert but no longer frightened. Elias placed a bowl of warm broth on the table and set a cup of water beside it. She shifted slowly, testing her legs before standing and making her way across the room. The stiffness in her joints was visible, but she pushed through it with determination. She tasted the broth and exhaled quietly as the warmth spread through her chest. Hunger returned in small waves. Elias could see her body fighting to regain its strength. He began checking the rope marks again, making sure no infection was setting in. She allowed him to examine her wrists, though she watched every movement with careful attention. Her trust was not yet earned, but her fear had eased. Later in the morning, she stepped outside for the first time. She leaned against the porch post while adjusting to the sunlight. The valley stretched open before her. Wide fields, a line of cottonwoods, and distant hills that marked the boundary she once crossed freely. Now, everything looked unfamiliar. She rubbed her wrists out of habit, tracing the bruised lines left behind. She asked Elias for her belongings, speaking slowly and choosing her words with care. He understood immediately. The absence of weapons, clothing, or small personal items had left a question lingering between them. Whoever buried her had taken everything. He offered her a folded blanket to use as a shawl until he could find something more suitable. She accepted it with a quiet nod. Throughout the day, she followed him to the barn, stepping cautiously on uneven ground. He repaired a broken hinge while she watched, observing how he handled tools and how the ranch operated. She had lived her entire life around people who worked together. The ranch was different, one person doing the labor of many. She studied the way he moved across the yard, how he checked the animals, and how he prepared each task with silent focus. She wanted to understand this place, because understanding it meant understanding the man who had saved her. Elias noticed her watching, but didn't comment. Instead, he explained what he was doing whenever she stood close enough to hear. The words came slowly at first. He rarely spoke for long stretches, but teaching her gave him a reason to fill the silence. She listened carefully, committing each detail to memory. By mid-afternoon, she insisted on helping him stack the cut firewood. Her movements were unsteady, but she refused to sit down. Elias weighed the risks in his mind, then decided not to stop her. The work wasn't heavy, and the repetition helped her regain balance and control. When she carried the last small log to the stack, she paused and wiped the dirt from her palms. The simple act of contributing eased something tight in her expression. While they worked, a distant glint on the ridge caught Elias's attention. He narrowed his eyes and scanned the hillside. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then the faint outline of two riders appeared against the horizon. They were far enough away to be mistaken for hunters, but the angle of their approach and the way they moved made him uneasy. Ayoka noticed the change in his posture. She followed his gaze, and her breath tightened. Recognition struck immediately. The distinctive shape of the saddlebags, the spacing between the riders, the deliberate pace. She knew her tribe's warriors when she saw them. Her hands trembled slightly before she drew them into the blanket. Elias turned toward her, reading the fear behind her silence. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. By evening, the riders were gone from sight, but Ayoka remained unsettled. She stayed near the cabin door while Elias prepared supper. She spoke more than she had before, explaining quietly that her tribe did not tolerate defiance. If they learned she was alive, they would return to reclaim her or punish whoever sheltered her. These details had been missing, but revealing them brought clarity to the danger approaching. Elias listened without interruption. Her voice carried no exaggeration, only the plain truth of someone who had lived through harsher judgments than most men ever faced. Hearing the full weight of what had been done to her hardened his resolve. After they finished eating, he walked the perimeter of the ranch, tightening the gate latch and checking the tools near the porch. Ayoka watched him through the window. She recognized the subtle shift in him, the way he stood straighter, the way his eyes moved across the valley. He was preparing without speaking it aloud. Inside, she folded the blanket around herself and sat near the stove. The warmth felt steady, grounding. She thought about the men on the ridge, the ones who had already decided she was no longer worth the food she consumed or the shelter she used. She thought about her life before the burial, quiet work, strict customs, expectations she could not fulfill. Now she was in a wooden cabin far from that world, sharing quiet tasks with a man who chose to help her without demand or obligation. As the fire settled into embers, she closed her eyes for a moment. Fear lingered, but it no longer controlled her completely. Another thought had taken root. If danger returned, she would not face it alone. Elias had already shown where he stood. Outside, the last light faded over the valley. Inside, two people continued the slow work of adjusting to each other's presence, unaware of how deeply their lives were beginning to connect. By the next morning, the tension in the air had settled into something steady but heavy. Ayoka stepped onto the porch early, pulling the blanket close around her shoulders as she scanned the far ridge. She searched for signs that the riders had returned, dust trails, shifting silhouettes, anything that would confirm what she already feared. The open valley looked calm, but her instincts told her the peace would not hold. Elias prepared the horses in the corral, checking the tack with more attention than usual. He watched Ayoka from the corner of his eye, noticing how she stood with her weight balanced forward, as if ready to move at the first sign of danger. Her recovery had progressed quickly, but her strength was still limited. He could see it in the way she gripped the porch rail to steady herself. Inside the cabin, a pot simmered on the stove. Elias made breakfast without speaking much, but when he handed her the plate, he waited until she took the first bite. The quiet between them was no longer strained. It carried a sense of preparation neither bothered to name. The day passed with slow, deliberate work. Ayoka helped repair a broken board on the small chicken coop. Elias used the opportunity to point out tools she hadn't seen before, showing her how to brace the wood and set the nails. She followed his instructions with care, pushing herself through the lingering weakness in her arms. While they worked, she asked what he planned if the riders came back. Her voice was steady, but her eyes stayed fixed on the board in front of her. Elias finished hammering the last nail before answering. He told her he had no intention of handing her over and no interest in inviting a fight unless they forced one. She absorbed the answer quietly. It was more than reassurance. It was a declaration of where he stood. Midday heat pressed over the yard when Ayoka suddenly stopped walking. She turned toward the ridge again. Elias followed her line of sight. This time, there was no doubt. For riders were descending the slope, moving slowly but with purpose. Their horses formed a clean line, and their approach showed they expected no resistance. Elias wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped closer to her. She felt her heartbeat rise, not from panic, but from the certainty that her past had finally arrived at the ranch. She stood upright, pulling the blanket tighter, then let it fall from her shoulders so she could move freely. Her expression shifted from fear to decision. The riders reached the gate and halted. Dust lifted around the horses' hooves. The man in front was older, his face marked with deep lines. His eyes settled on Ayoka, narrowing as he confirmed she was very much alive. He spoke her name with a stern finality that made her stand straighter. Elias positioned himself a step behind her, close enough to show he was not leaving her side, far enough to let her speak first. She did not look back at him. She didn't need to. His presence was steady and clear. The man told her she was meant to be buried and that her survival defied the elder's decision. He demanded she return so the sentence could be completed. His tone carried no anger, only the weight of custom. Ayoka lifted her chin. Her voice, still rough from the burial, held strength that surprised even her. She told them she would not go back, that her life belonged to her alone now, not to the traditions that had cast her aside. She spoke plainly, detailing how she had worked for the tribe, how she had fulfilled every duty asked of her, and how none of it mattered when she could not carry a child. These details had remained unspoken until now. The daily labor she performed, the strict expectations she faced, the years she endured the quiet disappointment of others. Her explanation filled the missing space in the story, giving the riders no ground to argue that she had been treated fairly. The man listened, his expression shifting from rigid certainty to a troubled hesitation. The riders glanced at Elias now, realizing he was not a passerby who happened upon her. He was someone prepared to defend her without aggression, without threats, just a steady commitment that was stronger than any loud warning. Elias kept his stance relaxed but ready. His eyes stayed fixed on the leader, and the message was clear. She is not alone here, and you will have to go through me to change that. The older warrior weighed the situation carefully. He saw Ayoka's resolve. He saw Elias's quiet readiness. He saw land that was not theirs and a conflict that would cost more than the elders were prepared to spend. After a long silence, he shifted the reins and told her the tribe would not pursue her again. His tone held something unfamiliar, respect, maybe, or unease at her refusal to accept the fate they had written for her. The riders turned their horses and rode back across the valley, leaving the ranch in stillness. Ayoka remained in place until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she release a slow, shaking breath. Elias stayed near her without speaking. When she stepped back toward the porch, he followed, ready to steady her if her legs weakened. Inside the cabin, she sat down at the table, her hands trembling as the adrenaline faded. Elias poured her water and set it in front of her. She looked up at him, trying to find words for the change she felt inside. Freedom, fear, gratitude, and the unfamiliar sense of belonging that had taken shape between them. He didn't ask her to explain anything. He only sat across from her, waiting for her breathing to settle. Outside, the yard carried the marks of their shared work. Inside, the cabin no longer held the quiet emptiness it once did. The threat that had followed her was gone, and the life she stepped into was no longer uncertain. A choice had been made in the yard, by her, by him, and by the men who chose not to take her back. It was a turning point neither of them could ignore. The riders were gone, but the silence they left behind settled differently than before. Ayoka stepped out onto the porch again, breathing slowly, testing the air as if confirming the danger had truly passed. The valley lay open and quiet, the hills still, the horizon clear. Her shoulders loosened for the first time since waking in the cabin. She let the blanket fall from her arms, feeling the warmth of the late afternoon sun against her skin. Elias watched her from the doorway, noting the steadiness in her stance. She no longer moved like someone expecting to be taken. She stood as a woman with her own direction. He stepped outside and joined her, leaning his hand on the porch rail. They didn't speak. The quiet between them now carried a sense of shared certainty rather than fear. Over the next days, their routine formed naturally. Ayoka helped with gathering wood and carrying feed, her strength returning with each task. Elias repaired a loose hinge on the barn, tightened the water pump, and cleared a patch of land behind the cabin that had gone unused. She joined him in each task, not because he asked her to, but because the work made her part of the place. One question still hung quietly between them: what her future would look like now that she was free. She answered it herself through actions long before she found the words. She organized the small tools inside the cabin, set aside herbs she gathered from the valley, and fixed a tear in the curtain by the stove. She prepared small meals when Elias worked late outside. She walked the land as if learning every shape of it until it felt familiar. She was not passing through. She was staying. On the fourth morning, Elias found her near the fence line examining a broken post. She touched the splintered wood and looked back at him with a simple question in her eyes: what needed to be done to fix it? He handed her a spare rail, and they worked side by side, settling the new post into the ground. Their movements lined up easily. He held the rail steady while she packed the dirt around it, and she braced the post while he set the nails. The openness of the valley around them reminded Ayoka of the freedom she had never been allowed to claim before. Her tribe expected her to survive only within the boundaries they created. Here, her life depended on her own decisions, and for the first time those decisions were shaping something steady. When the fence was finished, she rested her hand on top of the post. Elias stood beside her, brushing the dirt from his palms. She turned to him slowly, not searching for reassurance, but acknowledging what they had built over the last days. The connection grew through shared work, simple acts, and the space they allowed each other. She asked him quietly what he intended to do now that the threat was gone. It was a question that needed answering, one that filled the last empty space in her mind. He considered his response carefully, knowing she deserved clarity. He told her he planned to continue living on the ranch, as he always had, but the place no longer felt like a shelter for one. He wanted her to remain if she chose to, not out of obligation or debt, but because her presence had changed the cabin from a place of memory into a place that felt alive again. She listened, watching the tension in his jaw ease as he spoke honestly. She stepped closer, placing her hand over his, the gesture quiet but firm. She made her own intention clear: she would stay. Not because she was rescued, not because she needed protection, but because she had found a life that allowed her to stand as her own person. Together, they walked back to the cabin as the sun moved lower over the ridge. Elias grabbed the last tools from the yard and hung them by the barn door. Ayoka carried the water bucket to the porch, pausing to look over the land one more time. The place felt settled, safe, and shared. Inside, the cabin no longer resembled the empty home Elias kept after loss. 2 chairs were used now. 2 cups sat beside the stove. The quiet inside carried warm movement instead of absence. Ayoka folded her blanket on the bed and smoothed it with her palm, grounding herself in the simple truth that she no longer feared the night or the memories it carried. When evening came, they sat on the porch together, watching the last line of sunlight slide across the valley. Ayoka leaned her shoulder gently against Elias, not seeking shelter, but offering closeness that came from choice. He didn't speak. He only shifted enough for her to rest comfortably. Tomorrow, they would continue repairing what the ranch needed. Tomorrow, the fence line would stretch farther, the garden would grow, and the routines they formed would stay steady. Their lives had changed quietly, shaped by decisions neither had expected to make. The danger was gone, the past had released its hold, and the ranch stood as a place built by two people who had been broken in different ways but had chosen to heal beside one another. Their story settled into a calm, complete ending. Two hands on the same fence rail, two lives moving forward with clear purpose, in a home that no longer held space for loneliness.